Every time God changed someone's name in the Bible. There is a moment that repeats across Scripture so consistently it starts to feel deliberate. Not a plague, not a number, a name. A man spends decades known by one word, and then, at the exact hinge point of his story, God speaks, and the word changes. Abram becomes Abraham. Jacob becomes Israel. Simon becomes Peter. Saul becomes Paul. Each time the change lands at the precise moment, everything else in that person's life is being reordered. A covenant, a wrestling match, a commissioning, a conversion. Most people read these as simple relabeling, God picking a new nickname the way a coach picks a jersey number. But look closer at what actually happens inside these renamings, at the Hebrew letters involved and the timing of every single one, and a different picture forms. In Scripture, a name was never just a label. It was understood to carry a person's nature, their reputation, their destiny compressed into sound. And when God changes someone's name, He is not describing who they already are. He is declaring who they are about to become. The place to start is the concept of Shem itself, the Hebrew word for name, which shows up as early as Genesis 2, when God brings every living creature to Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. Naming, from the very first chapters of the Bible, is an act of authority and understanding combined, not arbitrary sound, but a claim about essential character. That is why, throughout the ancient Near East and especially in Israel's own story, changing someone's name was never a small gesture. A conquering king renaming a captured official, a father renaming a son. These were acts that reassigned identity itself. So when the text records God doing this, personally, by His own voice, to a small handful of people across the entire Bible, it is worth asking what those specific moments have in common, and what they are trying to tell the rest of us about how God works. The first, and in many ways, the template-setting renaming happens in Genesis 17, and it comes with a linguistic detail easy to miss in English, but impossible to miss in Hebrew. God appears to a 99-year-old man named Abram, meaning exalted father, and says, "Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, but thy name shall be Abraham, for a father of many nations have I made thee." Genesis 17:5. In the Hebrew text, the change is a single added letter, a hey, H, inserted into the middle of his name. Abram, Abram becomes Abraham, Abraham. That letter is not decorative. The Hey is one of the four letters that make up God's own personal covenant name, YHWH, and Jewish tradition has long noticed that God appears to be, quite literally, placing a piece of His own name inside Abram's, sealing the covenant not just in words, but in the very spelling of the man's identity. And the change is not cosmetic. Abram's original name promised he would be an exalted father. Abraham's new name, built from a wordplay on Av Hamon Goyim, father of a multitude of nations, promises something Abram had no natural way of producing, since he and his wife were both far past the age of children. The name is not a description of present reality. It is a declaration spoken over a barren future. That same letter, and that same pattern, appears 11 verses later, applied to his wife. "As for Sarai thy wife, thou shalt not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall her name be." Genesis 17:15. Sarai likely meant something close to my princess, a name defined by relationship to one household. Sarah drops the possessive and simply means princess, unqualified, and God's explanation makes the scope unmistakable. "She shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be of her." Genesis 17:16. Once again, the added letter is a hey, once again borrowed from God's own covenant name, once again given to someone whose body, by every natural measure, could not fulfill what the new name promised. Abraham and Sarah are the first renamings in the Bible, and they establish the pattern every later one follows. The change comes attached to a covenant. It involves letters connected to God's own name, and it is spoken before the promise is visibly true, not after. The next major renaming happens a generation later, in the middle of the night, beside a river, and it is one of the strangest scenes in all of Scripture. Jacob, whose name means heel-grabber or supplanter, a name he earned at birth by literally grasping his twin brother Esau's heel on the way out of the womb, Genesis 25:26, and then spent his entire adult life living up to, deceiving his father, cheating his brother out of a birthright, outmaneuvering his father-in-law Laban. On the night before he is set to reunite with the brother he wronged decades earlier, terrified Esau is coming with 400 men to kill him. Jacob is left alone, and a man wrestles with him until daybreak. Genesis 32:24. Jacob will not let go, even after his hip is wrenched out of joint, and demands a blessing. The stranger's response is the renaming itself. Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. Genesis 32:28. The Hebrew Yisrael is typically parsed as combining Sarah, to strive or contend, with El, God, God strives, or he strives with God. The supplanter who spent his life grabbing what he wanted by cunning is renamed the one who wrestles honestly, face to face, and does not let go. What makes this renaming different from Abraham's is that it does not fully erase the old name. Scripture keeps calling him Jacob for the rest of his life, sometimes in the very same sentence as Israel, as if the text wants you to hold both identities in view at once. The old nature not entirely gone, the new identity not yet total, both true simultaneously, which is arguably a more honest picture of what transformation actually looks like than a clean single switch. A subtler renaming happens inside Israel's own family a generation before the Exodus, when Moses is preparing to send 12 men to scout the land of Canaan. Numbers 13:16 records, almost in passing, "These are the names of the men which Moses sent to spy out the land. And Moses called Oshea the son of Nun, Jehoshua." Oshea means salvation, but Yehoshua, Joshua, attaches the divine name directly to it. The Lord is salvation. It is easy to read past this one, tucked into a list of 12 names, but it carries enormous weight forward. Of the 12 spies sent into Canaan, 10 return with a report of fear that leads an entire generation into 40 years of wandering. Numbers 13:31-33. Only Joshua and Caleb trust God's promise, and it is that renamed man, the one carrying the Lord is salvation as his identity, who eventually leads the next generation into the promised land. And centuries later, when an angel tells a frightened man named Joseph what to name Mary's son, the name given is the exact same Hebrew name in its later form, Yeshua, Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins. Matthew 1:21. Joshua's renaming is a quiet foreshadowing planted more than 1,000 years before the name would be spoken over a manger in Bethlehem. There is a smaller, easily overlooked renaming inside the story of David and Bathsheba that reveals something different about how God uses this pattern, not to launch someone into a new mission, but to speak grace over a family that had just survived catastrophic failure. After David's affair with Bathsheba and the death of their first child as a consequence of his sin, they have another son, and David names him Solomon, Shlomo, from Shalom, peace. But 2 Samuel 12:25 adds a detail most readers skip past. And he sent by the hand of Nathan the prophet, and he called his name Jedidiah, because of the Lord. Jedidiah means beloved of the Lord. This is the only renaming in the Bible delivered through a third party, a prophet relaying God's own affection for a child born directly out of the worst chapter of his parents' lives. The renaming here is not a commissioning for a task. It is a declaration of love spoken over the evidence of grace outlasting sin, and it arrives at exactly the point in the story where the reader would least expect God to be handing out affectionate nicknames. If you are starting to notice that every one of these renamings lands at the exact seam between an old identity and an impossible new calling, that pattern holds all the way into the New Testament, and it is worth sitting with before we get there, because it means this was never a one-time device God used only in Israel's founding stories. It was a signature he kept using. If this kind of pattern is opening up something new in a story you thought you already knew, the best way to help someone else find it is to subscribe and leave a comment. Even one word helps, and pass it along to someone who might need to hear that a name can change. The clearest New Testament echo of Genesis 17 happens the moment Jesus first meets a fisherman named Simon. John 1:42 records it in a single verse. And when Jesus beheld him, he said, "Thou art Simon the son of Jonah. Thou shalt be called Cephas," which is by interpretation, a stone. Cephas is Aramaic, Kepha, rock, and its Greek translation, Petros, becomes Peter. The renaming happens before Simon has done anything to earn it, before a single miracle, before a single sermon, on the strength of nothing but Jesus looking at him and speaking a future into existence, exactly like Abram receiving a name that meant Father of Nations while he was still childless. And the parallel gets sharper later, in Matthew 16, when Peter becomes the first disciple to declare, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus responds by doubling down on the name he had already given him years earlier, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." Matthew 16:16-18. What makes Peter's renaming so striking and so honest is the same tension present in Jacob's story. Peter spends the rest of the Gospels being anything but rock-like. He sinks while walking on water. He rebukes Jesus and is called Satan for it in the very next breath. He denies knowing Jesus 3 times on the night of the crucifixion. The name was never a report card on his current character. It was, like Abraham's, like Israel's, a declaration spoken over what he would become, not what he currently was. The final major renaming in the Bible belongs to a man who spent years trying to destroy the very movement he would come to lead. Saul of Tarsus is introduced holding the coats of the men stoning Stephen to death. Acts 7:58, and Acts 9:1 says he was yet breathing out threatenings and slaughter against the disciples of the Lord. His conversion on the road to Damascus is one of the most sudden reversals in Scripture. A blinding light, a voice, 3 days of darkness and fasting. But the actual name change is easy to miss if you are reading quickly, because the text does not stage it with the ceremony of Abram or Jacob's encounters. Acts 13:9 simply notes, in the middle of a missionary journey years after his conversion, "Then Saul," who also is called Paul. And from that verse forward, the narrative simply starts calling him Paul. Scholars debate exactly what is happening here, since Saul, a devout Jew from Tarsus, likely carried both a Hebrew name and a Roman name his entire life, the way many Jews of the diaspora did, which means this may be less a supernatural renaming like Abraham's and more a narrative shift in emphasis, the text choosing to foreground his Roman name at the exact moment his mission pivots fully toward the Gentile world. Whatever the precise mechanism, the timing is not incidental. The shift from Saul to Paul happens right as he begins the ministry that will take the gospel to the ends of the Roman Empire, and centuries of readers have rightly heard an echo of the older pattern in it. A man's public identity reoriented at the exact hinge point where his mission changes. Step back now and look at what these renamings have in common, because the pattern is the real argument underneath all of them. Every single one lands at a threshold, not in the comfortable middle of someone's story, but at the exact point where an old identity is being retired and a new assignment is beginning. Abram becomes Abraham the moment the covenant is formalized. Jacob becomes Israel the night before he has to face the brother he wronged. Simon becomes Peter the first time Jesus looks at him. Saul becomes Paul as the mission to the nations opens. And in every case but one, the name is given before the person has done anything to deserve it, spoken as a promise over a future not yet visible, rather than a medal for a past already proven. That is what separates these moments from ordinary nicknames. A nickname describes what people already see in you. These names describe what God intends to do through you, and then the rest of each person's story becomes the slow, often stumbling process of growing into a name spoken over them in advance. There is one more layer to this pattern, and it points forward rather than back, past every renaming already in Scripture, toward one still promised but not yet delivered. Isaiah 62:2 describes a coming restoration in language that reaches beyond any single individual. Thou shalt be called by a new name, which the mouth of the Lord shall name. And Revelation 2:17 picks up that same thread at the very end of the Bible, describing a promise made to him that overcometh, a hidden manna, and then a white stone, and in the stone a new name written, which no man knoweth saving he that receiveth it. Every renaming traced through this study, Abraham, Sarah, Israel, Joshua, Jedidiah, Peter, Paul, turns out to be a rehearsal for something Scripture says is still coming, a name given not to a handful of patriarchs and apostles at the hinge points of Israel's history, but to anyone who belongs to God, spoken personally, privately, known only between the giver and the one who receives it. That is the thread running underneath every one of these stories. Abram did not become Abraham by earning it. Jacob did not become Israel by winning the wrestling match. He became Israel by refusing to let go, even while losing it. Simon did not become Peter by already being steady. He became Peter while he was still the least steady man in the room. Every name change in the Bible is God speaking a finished identity over an unfinished person, and then spending years, sometimes decades, walking that person into the truth of what he already called them. The same voice that renamed a childless old man father of nations, and a deceiver Israel, and a fisherman a rock, and a persecutor an apostle, is the same voice Scripture says still has a name written on a white stone, waiting to be spoken over whoever is willing to answer to something better than the name they have been carrying. If this was meaningful for you, the biggest thing you can do to support this channel is to subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with someone else. That is genuinely how people find this content.